Hey all, it's Kayce Cover, your host on Training with Kayce. And today is episode 9, What's Operant Conditioning? We're going to take a quick dip into the pond of operant conditioning. But first, a shout out to our producer, Joe Laughlin. He's on sick leave today, and we wish him a speedy recovery. And now let's get started. So, marine mammal trainers are often steeped in operant conditioning, but many other kinds of trainers hear about it, and they often hear it misdescribed, the terminology misused, so that if they learn verbally or by apprenticing, as many, if not most, animal trainers do, they may have a kind of a corrupted experience with what operant conditioning is. And this is, made even worse by the fact that the terminology of operant conditioning is complicated and many people do not use it correctly. Yeah, we'll talk about that another time. I'm a stickler for terminology, but I'll tell you the truth. In real life, most of life happens in the gray areas. And terminology is very specific. It's not about the gray areas in general. It's about the absolute cases. And so the longer I've gone on with training, the less I use terminology. But anyway, we can talk about terminology again later. There's a lot to discuss there. But let's talk about operant conditioning. What is that? Well, let's talk about what an operant is first. An operant is a behavior that operates on the environment to achieve a goal. So if you pick a banana so that you can eat it, the operant is picking or harvesting the banana, and the goal is to be able to ingest the banana. If you close the door to shut out the cold, the operant is shutting the door, and the goal is to stay warmer. And it goes on and on. The crux is you do some physical action in order to create a result. Now, there's another kind of conditioning, which is called instrumental conditioning or classical. Operant is instrumental. There's also classical conditioning. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the conditioning part of operant conditioning. So we said the operant is a behavior that is done in order to obtain a goal. And conditioning is the learned association between the operant and consequence. Now, I said a learned association. I did not say a consciously learned association. On the contrary, operant conditioning may become consciously understood, but it can also be solely subconscious or unconscious learning. And it's usually accomplished through rote repetition. So in the rote repetition, you do the same behavior over and over and over again, which kind of beats a neural pathway in your brain, kind of like a neural habit or a neural groove, which the following behavior, future behavior tends to flow down that pathway. And you might think it's a really good thing because the animal will kind of automatically do something if conditions are just right. But I actually don't find it very useful. So way back when I got started, a lot of people had prop cued behaviors. And here, instead of telling the animal what to do, when the animal saw a certain prop, it would just automatically act on them. So let's say it was a parrot, because it was often in bird shows, and A bicycle was put in front of the parrot, and the parrot knew that it should ride the bicycle. Or a tightrope was put in front of the parrot, and it knew it should walk the tightrope. Well, as long as that prop was there, the animal didn't necessarily have to listen to the trainer. And because of that kind of work, a lot of the birds didn't necessarily have strong relationships with their trainers. And it could cause a lot of, let's say, creativity during the show. Yeah. But it was a very simple process. But in my work, I don't want that process. So one thing that I have worked with is dogs that are trained for search and recovery. And most of the time that I've seen, these dogs are taught to, for example, sit when they sense their target, So if they're looking for bodies in collapsed buildings, when they smell or sense somebody that, needs help, they'll sit. Well, at 9/11, this was a very bad thing because these dogs were in a very toxic environment. And you don't want your dog sitting in the middle of toxic dust. You'd probably rather have him have booties on and remain standing. But the conditioning was so strong in the dogs that it's nearly impossible to get an animal to override that conditioning. Okay, so I don't want a rote response. I don't want an automatic response. I want a considered response. There's always a situation in which I want the animal to intelligently disobey. And so I just don't want operant conditioning in general. Now, if operant conditioning is the training of behaviors that act on the environment, what about emotions and reflexes? Can those be trained? Well, this was a gray area when I first got started. I've been writing about conditioned relaxation since about 1990. And at that time, many scientists confronted me with the idea that you could not condition relaxation. Why? Because it's not an operant. It also isn't a reflex. It's a physiological response. Maybe it's a mental response. It's an emotion. Maybe it deserves its own class. In any case, it didn't fit into the operant conditioning category. So some of the scientists said you can't do that. And yet, we cue the animal to get relaxed, and they'll flop on the ground and get relaxed. And then we cue them to get alert, and they'll jump up, and they're alert. And then we cue them to get relaxed, and they flop on the ground again. They're conditioned. All right? And it's an incredibly useful thing to condition an animal to do. So I would suggest that no matter how you classify an emotion, whether it's a reflex or a response or a mental state, it can be conditioned. It may be classically conditioned instead of operant conditioned. Oh, by the way, I should also mention instrumental conditioning. Not sure how both those phrases come together, but instrumental conditioning is just a shade of difference from operant conditioning. In instrumental conditioning, the animal's behavior is instrumental in accomplishing a desired goal. So I think it's the same thing as operant conditioning, but we'll leave it there. Okay, there's lots of other terms that we need to talk about that are from operant conditioning. For example, what's with the word punisher? How'd that ever get stuck in there? Huh? Let's talk about that next time. All right, take care and thank you so much for joining me. Bye bye now.